to Facebook. Okay, broadcast started, attendees coming in. Going live on Facebook. Facebook live streaming starting. Okay, I think live stream should be through. I'm just going to confirm that. Okay, we're clear to go.
Great. And our attendees are with us and we're recording.
Yep, 34 attendees right now in the Zoom.
Hi, everyone. Just making sure that all of our technology is working. Welcome. This is a Climate Action Network Canada webinar on Canadian climate accountability. And we are joined by an incredible cast of experts. So I'll introduce those folks in a moment, and then I'll share some opening words and then we'll dive right into the details. But first I want to begin by acknowledging that I am calling in today from unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territories in what is also known as Ottawa. We have run a series of webinars through Climate Action Network Canada over the years. You can always find the recordings of those webinars on our website at climateactionnetwork.ca. You can also find some of that content on YouTube at our YouTube channel. If you just search for Climate Action Network Canada on YouTube, you should be able to figure that out. And then of course we are live streaming across Facebook platforms right now. So really excited to be engaging with audiences from different organizations outside of our own. So hi everyone. Today on the line, we have Jen Lash from CISU Consulting, who I'm sure many of you have had the pleasure of working with over the years. She's done an incredible amount of work helping to convene conversations and has helped indeed to convene this one around Canadian climate accountability. So she'll be our MC for today, and I'll be handing the reins to her once I finish my opening remarks. And then we will hear from Julia Kroom from EcoJustice on a paper that was released, a series of papers actually that was released over the last couple of weeks from a consortium of organizations, including EcoJustice, Climate Action Network Canada, Environmental Defence Canada, Equiterre, West Coast Environmental Law, and the Pembina Institute. So we'll be hearing about those reports from Julia. We'll then hear from Jason Dion of the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, who also released papers on Canadian climate accountability this week. It's like all the buzz, all the rage is Canadian climate accountability. Who knew? It's pretty exciting. So Jason will be sharing the CICC's report findings and recommendations. And then we'll turn to Tracy Saxby from My Sea and Sky, who also works very closely with the Climate Caucus, which is a municipal caucus, or a caucus of municipal climate leaders. And Tracy will be sharing some of the cool work that she has been doing with Climate Caucus on tools for municipal scale climate accountability. I also want to point out that on the line, we have some guest appearances from Dale Marshall of Environmental Defence Canada, Caroline Brulette of Equiterre, and Andrew Gage of West Coast Environmental Law, who will be hopping on board for our panel conversation once the presentations are through. Today's webinar is a bit of a longer one. It's a 90-minute one, just because this is a very juicy topic and we wanted to make sure to leave enough time for conversation. So yeah, stick around, and if you're not able to stay for the whole thing, be rest assured that the recording will be available to you along with the presentations once we're through. And with that, I will start with some introductory remarks. Sorry, I'm just having a hard time finding the right window. Here we go. Okay, so here we are. I mentioned the release of these papers from this consortium of 6 organizations. You can find those papers on the websites of all of our organizations. I would encourage you to take a look at those if this is an issue you're really curious about. There is a shorter 10-page document that is a kind of punchier look at our recommendations for Canadian climate accountability. And then there's a really long, extremely thorough, well-researched document that kind of backs up that shorter document for those of you who want to dive deeper. Why are we here? All right, so in 2018, we got this landmark report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on global warming 1.5 degrees Celsius. I was really privileged to be a part of the release of that report, and that report really changed the world because it gave us a look at what it means if we exceed an average of 1.5 degrees of warming, and it also told us how much carbon budget we have left if we're going to try to hold global warming to levels that can help avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change, and and help countries in small and island developing states, for instance, avoid having to move entire populations out of their home islands. That carbon budget is quite small, so we learned from that report that we have just about 10 years left at current emissions levels before we fill up the remaining carbon budget for 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that means we need to be driving emissions down really aggressively over the next decade so we can avoid reaching those tipping points. If the world has a climate budget, if there's a carbon budget globally, then of course there's carbon budgets for countries at the national scale. And so we have to ask ourselves what that means for a Canadian context. Unfortunately, when it comes to Canada's action on climate change, we have a really long history of missing targets. So we have been setting climate goals since the early 1990s, and so far we've missed every single target we have set. We have 2 targets coming up, one this year in 2020 that we are very much off track from meeting. And we of course have our 2030 Paris Pledge, which is currently to reduce emissions by 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. And that's what we've signed our name to in the Paris Agreement. In 2015, when Canada was thinking through the Paris Agreement and over the course of designing the Pan-Canadian Framework on Climate Change and Clean Growth, we saw this kind of red line of emissions where we were at in 2015 out to 2030. If we carried on with business as usual from there, we would be, exceeding 815 megatons of emissions by 2030. Thankfully, the PCF, the measures in the Pan-Canadian framework, along with some of the measures being taken at the provincial and territorial levels, brought those predicted emissions down to that blue line where you see the 2019 predictions out to 2030. And if we are able to implement all of the measures described in the PCF, along with some of the measures of the provincial and territorial levels really well, and we add a bit more ambition to it, then current projections have us hitting this green line or the little green dot below it, which is still off track to meet our 2030 target, which is that orange diamond right there at the bottom. So we've got our work cut out for us just to hit our existing Paris Agreement promise. But of course, we know that promise is insufficient. So Canada is historically responsible for the problem of climate change. We've been one of the world's top net emitters for the last century. We've never moved out of one of the top 10 emitters for the last decade, or for the last century, I should say. When it comes to per capita emissions, Canadians pollute more than pretty much anyone anywhere else in the world. And, you know, there are reasons that we can have a conversation about that, but the reality is that Canada is a huge contributor to the problem, both currently and historically. And we also have the means to address the issue with being one of the wealthiest nations on the planet. And so Climate Action Network Canada, when we think about what Canada's fair share of the global effort to confront climate change is in a 1.5 degree scenario, we say that Canada's emissions reduction goal by 2030 should be doubled to reduce emissions 60% below 2005 levels by 2030. And alongside that, we need to be greatly expanding our efforts to be driving down emissions outside of Canadian borders in order to account for that historic responsibility and to acknowledge our ability and our resources to take action. So all that to say that right now, while progress has been made, we're still off track to meeting our 2030 goals, and our 2030 goals need to get a whole lot more ambitious if we're actually going to contribute our fair share. And that's where Canadian climate accountability comes in really for us. So at a certain point, if you keep choosing the wrong target, from our perspective, you need to ask yourself if there's something you need to change about the way you're doing climate action. And from our perspective, it's clear that Canada needs to make that change. And if we take a look around the world, and I'll touch on that in a minute, we see that those jurisdictions that are taking climate action really seriously right now are doing just that. They're changing the way they're taking action on climate change by introducing legislative and institutional mechanisms to hold them accountable to their commitments. To make sure, so we need that in Canada to make sure that when Canada, when the spotlight of international pressure under which Canada makes climate commitments is turned off, that Canada continues to deliver on those commitments. And there are these three elements of accountability: answerability, where we ask, what's Canada going to do to meet its commitments? Why are those the actions we're taking? Responsibility, where we ask who's responsible for what. We make sure that there are clearly delineated pathways of responsibility. And then, of course, enforceability. How do we make sure that there are consequences when we fail to meet our goals? And this, of course, might sound familiar because it's really what we've been seeing over the course of the last few months. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen the Canadian government and other governments around the world listen to experts, set out clear targets and goals with clear timelines, develop an action plan and execute it, test, measure, and assess progress toward targets and goals, and recalibrate when new data is available and course correction is necessary. This is what it takes to address an emergency. And we're saying these are the steps, the exact same steps that we need to address the climate emergency. Because right now, the way we're doing things on climate is basically equivalent to saying by 2050, we are going to have 0 cases of COVID-19, and then not implementing the plans and the milestones that need to be put into place to make sure that happens. So if we're going to get to net zero by 2050, then we have to implement those milestones and those plans along the way. As I said, this is happening in other jurisdictions. So all those jurisdictions in green are places where we've seen climate accountability measures adopted. In blue is where we're seeing climate accountability measures considered. Right here in Canada, we have the British Columbia Climate Change Accountability Act. We have elements of accountability measures in legislation passed in Manitoba, and we have Quebec considering an accountability framework as well. And I'll finish off by just saying that a lot of this is based on the UK Climate Change Act. It passed in 2008. That gave us some really great ideas to work from. A lot of the accountability measures in other jurisdictions are based on this act. And it also gives us some really good learning opportunities. So we can not only take what's been really good from the UK Act and build on it, but we can also learn from what it was missing and make sure that we don't miss the same things. I'm going to stop there and hand it over to Jen for the rest of our conversation.
Thanks, Kat. That is a very succinct and eloquent overview of both the problems that we're facing right now in meeting our climate goals and the potential opportunity we have to address that. So now I'd like to introduce Julia, the staff lawyer with Julia Kroom, staff lawyer with EcoJustice, who's going to start to dig into a little bit of the how. How do we actually start to bring make this accountability, climate accountability work? So Julia, turning it over to you.
Thanks, Kat. And I'm going to be continuing on with the slides. Perfect. Thank you. And Jen. Okay, before I get started, I would like to acknowledge I'm joining you from Toronto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe and Wendat peoples. We'll dive right in. So Kat set the stage for you. And one way to think about it, you're gonna be hearing about a couple of different cornerstones, pillars, planks, and so on, and bear with me. But one way to think about what we need to deliver when we deliver climate accountability legislation, we've broken out here into 3 cornerstones. What's the first cornerstone? Well, it's to clearly set goals for the challenge we need to address, both with respect to mitigation and adaptation. That makes sense. You need to know where you're going, what you're aiming to fix. And so the legislation we recommend, the climate accountability legislation we would recommend, would set some specific goals. It would also, more importantly, require the government to continually reassess those goals and set new ones down the road. Our second cornerstone is a legislated planning and reporting system. That system would establish an iterative process, an adaptive process for the delivery of plans to address those goals and challenges, the delivery of reports on emissions and progress, and the delivery of answers, a kind of conversation between the government, parliament, civil society, and independent experts, which will increase ambition and make sure that that spotlight Kat mentioned remains on delivering the actual action that we need. The last cornerstone is the system of independent expert oversight, and that would take the form, we suggest, of an arm's length expert committee. We use 5 pillars in our report. So for those of you brave enough to dive into either the briefer policy report or the somewhat massive detailed report, we use 5 pillars, and you'll see that we use that lens to break out the key components of legislation. And so what I'll do is take you through each of these 5 pillars in turn. Pillar 1, long-term targets. These are what we would call the target setting provisions in a law. They're the most straightforward in many ways. They act as the lodestar for your legislation. Accountability legislation should set the net zero target for 2050 and a more ambitious 2030 target, as Kat discussed. Government's already clearly committed to do this. When they do it in the law, they should be using language like shall, or it is the duty of, to assign clearest possible responsibility on the ministers. As for who the ministers should be, this is actually a really important question. They need to individually or in the aggregate be in a position to deliver on all these elements here listed on this slide. So facilitate intergovernmental coordination, align financial budgets with carbon budgets, which I'll explain in a moment. Engage those high emitting sectors, transportation, oil and gas, and relatedly facilitate the intergovernmental coordination across those key departments. All of that needs to be happening for this whole of economy challenge to be met. And you have to identify the right actors to get that job done. Pillar 2, these are 5-year carbon budgets. And I'll deal with them super briefly. For those of you who want to get into a bit more of the technical detail of carbon budgets, again, refer you to the reports. But essentially, we need to break long-term goals down into medium-term goals. Carbon budgets, like household budgets, break down how much GHGs, how much in the way of GHG emissions we can spend on our pathway to net zero. And this is as important, if not more so, than the 2050 target. As Kat's video at the beginning showed you, we have this remaining global carbon budget. We need to stay within our share of the budget on our way to net zero. The bar chart, which I think was, yes, just there, that illustrates how the UK set their first few carbon budgets. They broke down their pathway to this is their former target, which was 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. They've now adopted a net zero by 2050. And you can see that they break them down into specific volumes to be emitted over a 5-year period. We propose using the same approach. Why 5 years? Well, based on international examples, this provides a good balance between predictability and flexibility. You don't have to be so specific exactly what you need to do in a given year, but you're not being so vague. It's what we have to do over a 10-year period. So it strikes a balance. We recommend the legislation require each budget be set at least 10 years in advance. So the carbon budget for the period of 2032 through, say, 2035 would have to be set no later than 2022. You know 10 years in advance what that budget is that you're going to have to plan to stay within. That lead time provides you with enough time to align, set up the policies and regulations which will have that effect at the key moment. Expert input into the carbon budgets is key. Budgets must be ambitious but ultimately achievable, and the independent experts will be invaluable in advising on what technical considerations go into setting those carbon budgets. The picture I've painted this far is pretty similar to international best practice. We closely modeled this on UK and New Zealand in particular, but Canada has some unique features. For one, we're a federal system, and the power to act on climate change is a matter of overlapping federal and provincial jurisdiction, and municipalities are a big part of that too. We also really need to be considering Indigenous governments and perspectives. So there's a lot of different actors and voices in the mix. We also have significant regional disparity in emissions. And the combination of these two factors in particular mean that we have this ongoing conversation happening about how to share the burden for reducing our GHG emissions across the provinces and territories. When Kat outlined those key elements of a robust accountability framework at the beginning, so answerability, making people who are responsible answerable for their actions and decisions, responsibility, being clear about who is responsible for what, and enforceability, making sure that the consequences attached for failing to live up to commitments. If we're going to deliver an accountability system that has all of those robust elements, then in our view, we need to break out national carbon budgets into subnational carbon budgets. So what would that look like? A subnational carbon budget would break each national 5-year carbon budget equitably and efficiency on the basis of technical input from experts and a more general consultation with Canadians about equity and fairness. Each subnational budget would set maximum emissions from within the geographic boundaries of the given province or territory. It wouldn't be about who does what, but it'd be about just the emissions, point source of the emissions. The responsibility for reducing emissions would still involve action from all levels of government. The subnational carbon budgets would not be binding on the provinces and territories themselves, although the province or territory could certainly elect to, through their own legislation, make that budget binding. But they would be binding in the final kind of Hail Mary moment on the federal government. So there would ultimately be a requirement on the responsible ministers to achieve the national carbon budget by achieving the subnational carbon budgets, thus achieving our goals fairly and equitably. The legislation wouldn't set the carbon budgets themselves, either national or subnational. It sets a process for doing that. So there'd be timelines established. The responsible minister shall set the carbon budget for the budget period, blah, 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 by this date. Pillar 3 is the last goal setting or challenge setting of the 3 cornerstones that I mentioned. We need a clear picture of what Canada needs to do, not only to mitigate, but also what it needs to do to adapt. We're experiencing the impacts of climate change now in different ways across the country, and they'll only be worsening. So the law we propose would mandate regular reports every 5 years, setting out the risks climate change poses to Canada. The expert committee would provide advice on these reports, much the way it would do for the carbon budgets. Pillar 4 is that iterative system of planning and reporting. So what you would do, what we want to create, is a system of planning to meet the goals or the challenge, readjusting, reporting on progress, readjusting your plan as needed, acting again, and so on, an iterative process. When you break that out, the requirements would be, as we proposed in our reports, the government be required to table a plan on how it will meet each carbon budget, say within a year of setting that carbon budget. It would similarly have to table a plan on how we will adapt to the impacts of climate change, say a year after each impact report, setting out the risks. The expert committee would be issuing reports on progress, as does the government. So you have two sets. It forms a check. And the government would have to respond to the experts' reports, particularly where the results, the monitoring, is showing a gap between action and the necessary results that we need to achieve. This plays out as illustrated in the next slide. You set the budget, table the plan to meet the budget, publish the impact report, table the plan to adapt to the impacts, and so on. And this would continue forward. Every few years, you'd have that process. Annually, we would be having the reporting. So there would be really layers of work being done, continually, predictably, on a schedule made clear in the legislation itself. The last key element is an arm's length expert committee. So that committee would be made up of independent experts on climate change, clean tech, economics, with representation of regional and Indigenous perspectives. They'd be required under the law to provide advice on the targets, on the carbon budgets, and the impact reports. They would also provide advice on the plans. On top of providing advice, they must, independent of government, monitor and report on progress. The next slide shows how their inputs would feed into the flow of the system that I've described. It gives you a sense of the order of operations. I won't get into specifically how it works. Again, whoever wants more detail can dive into those long reports we mentioned. So each of these 5 pillars, which I've set out, has a specific role to play in delivering a robust climate accountability framework that actually achieves all those key elements, to make sure that government is answerable, responsible, and that the whole system is enforceable. You weaken any one of the pillars and the strength, the robustness starts to fall away. In our view, the system that results would be much, much less likely to actually break our cycle of missed targets. More specifically, when we talk about and make recommendations for this framework to sort of situate this somewhat like legal academic seeming exercise in the real world, COP25, the Canadian government announced to the world it would legislate net zero and strengthen its 2030 target. COP26 has been delayed, but countries are still expected to submit preliminary NDCs. We think that the 2020 NDC for Canada should include accountability mechanisms like we've described here, a commitment to enact them in law. And ideally, we'd like to see a bill as soon as possible outlining what we've proposed. So that kind of gives you a high level, somewhat detailed in places, but with that, I'd like to hand it over back to Jim.
Thanks, Julia. And in my rush to dive into all that great information that Julia has, I forgot to geolocate myself. For those of you who don't know me, I am based in the unceded territory of the Kwakwaka'wakw First Nations on Malcolm Island and in the town called Sointula, which is the north end of Vancouver Island. So that information that Julia shared with us was from a report prepared by a consortium of organizations, of environmental groups that had been worked on for quite some time, and a lot of really deep thinking went into that. And so it was quite interesting that at the same time, there was another group also doing a lot of deep thinking on this issue, and they released their report around the same time, which was not planned, but really quite interesting. It felt like we had a lot of great synergy on things. And so now I'd like to turn to Jason Dion from the Canadian Institute of Climate Choices to share the results of the research and analysis that they have done on climate accountability. Jason?
Thank you, Jen. So hi, everyone. I'm Jason Dion. I'm the Mitigation Research Director for the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. Like Kat, I'm calling in from Ottawa today on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin. So allow me to just share my screen and I will walk you through a bit of a deck I've prepared. Just stand by. So I'll give a bit of a talk today that focuses on some critical questions that we laid out in our report when it comes to the question of how Canada can implement climate accountability in its unique context. So before I get into it though, I just wanted to start by kind of giving a bit of a background of the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. We're a new organization, so some of you might be unfamiliar. So we are a federally funded independent think tank that got its start just in January of this year. So we have hit the ground running with a number of reports, including the one I'll be talking about today. And so we're really organized around questions like, what are the challenges and opportunities along Canada's path to 2050? How can we measure success along the way across multiple dimensions? So, not just a bean counting GHG exercise. And what choices do we have? And what are their implications? And our objective is to provide clarity around questions like that. So we have an independent board of directors. So while we are federally funded, we have no government representation on our board. We have over 30 expert panelists who provide input into our work around mitigation, adaptation, and clean growth, and they're mostly from academia. We also have an advisory group with representatives from civil society and industry, and actually Kat is on that advisory group. And we also have a staff focused on not only research, but engagement and communications. And engagement and communications is not an afterthought at the Institute. We aim to very much make an effort to make sure our work gets out there in the right hands. And finally, we have a network of partners. So we are the product of a number of different organizations that came together to submit a joint proposal to give a start to this new Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. So we can leverage the work of that group and their knowledge and expertise in our work as well. So with that being said, I'll kind of move to this discussion of our report. So our report has three parts, and I'm really just going to focus on the latter two. So the first part is about climate accountability in practice. So, and why do we need this sort of thing? And how has it been done abroad? So we looked at a number of international case studies where this has been applied, and a couple of domestic ones as well, looking at BC and Manitoba. And from that, in our report, we draw out a number of common elements. So, what do we see always when we look across these case studies? And also some best practices that emerge from that. There's enough overlap in what we find and what Eco-Justice and partners found in their review that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on there. I think Julia just gave you a great overview of the kind of foundational elements that go into climate accountability. So I'm really going to focus my talk on these latter two parts. So first, climate accountability in the Canadian context. What are the key choices Canada has to make in applying it here? And really a lot of them relate to this question of how you do it in a federation. And then I'll also talk about some of the conclusions and recommendations we draw in the report. So climate accountability in the Canadian context. So Canadian policymakers can and should draw lessons and best practices from the international experience that we highlight in our report in developing their own climate accountability frameworks. However, these experiences have to be applied according to Canada's context, reflecting the unique challenges and opportunities that implementing this kind of thing here will pose. And some of those challenges include the following, and others have talked about this a bit already. First, that reaching net zero emissions by 2050 in Canada is going to be a huge undertaking and will require policy stringency well beyond anything seen to date. Second, shared jurisdiction between federal, provincial, and territorial governments over climate change policy adds a lot of complexity to legislating a climate accountability framework. And third, developing an accountability framework here requires doing so in a way that recognizes Indigenous rights. Moving to opportunities, the upside is that in addressing these challenges and implementing an accountability framework here, Canadian policymakers don't need to start from scratch. Across Canada, there's experience and examples to learn from. So key examples include Manitoba's Carbon Savings Account and BC's Climate Change Accountability Act. And there are also a number of policy processes and reporting requirements that are in place today that are consistent with some of the elements of a climate accountability framework. So there's a bit of a foundation there to build on. So in the report, we explore 3 key design choices that we see as having significant implications for the fundamental approach Canada will take to climate accountability, how it will play out in the Federation, and how successful it will ultimately be in helping governments deliver on their long-term goals. So these 3 choices are: 1, where do milestones bind? 2, what is the process for setting the milestone pathway? 3, which levels of government develop policy to meet milestones? And for each choice, we present a spectrum of available options and discuss the trade-offs that each present. So I'll provide a bit of an overview of that here. So first, where do milestones bind? Or at what level are legally binding milestones set? So the 3 options we identify are: 1, that they remain at the national level only; 2, that they're broken out by province and territory; or 3, broken out by sector. So it's important to note here that these options are not mutually exclusive. It's possible, for example, to break out milestones by both sector as well as by province and territory. So a first option in this choice is to set milestones only at the national level. So this type of approach can sidestep contentious decisions around how the burden of addressing climate change gets shared across provinces and territories or across sectors. Importantly, it provides a signal of national level policy stringency. However, this option risks centralizing accountability for meeting a national milestone with the federal government, thereby limiting subnational accountability. Plus, it may only defer difficult burden sharing debates and decisions, which will inevitably arise when governments craft policy for meeting those national level milestones. So a second option is to break milestones out by provinces and territories. Having legally binding milestones at the provincial level would permit policymakers to set milestones in a way that reflected the unique economies, emissions profiles, and abatement opportunities that exist in different regions of the country, and to clearly signal the level of GHG reduction effort required. However, this approach offers less flexibility in how national level targets get met, which can raise costs. It also faces the difficult challenge of defining regional burden sharing head on, which is likely to be highly contentious. The third option is to break milestones out by sector. So this approach provides more concrete guidance than the other options on how and where emission reductions should occur. It also avoids directly taking on regional burden sharing challenges. And I say directly because if we're talking about, for example, an oil and gas milestone breakout, then you're talking about certain regions of the country, obviously. However, with this option, it faces the same challenges as binding subnational targets in that it risks creating rigidities that can raise the overall cost of reducing emissions. So pros and cons with each approach. So the second choice that we map out in the report is: what is the process for setting the milestone pathway? So the 4 options we identify are that 1, provinces and territories set their own targets, which in sum define the national milestones and pathway. 2, provincial, territorial, and federal governments come together to collectively determine the national milestone pathway, or excuse me, the milestone pathway. The federal government sets the pathway is another option. This would be based on consultation and engagement with stakeholders, other levels of government, and Indigenous peoples, but the federal government would make the final call. And 4th, the independent expert advisory body determines the pathway. So it's important to note here that the role of that independent expert body would exist across all of these options, but in options 1 to 3, they would not be making the final decision. However, they'd still be providing recommendations and advice to governments on how to set the pathway. So let's dig a bit deeper into the pros and cons of these various options. First, provinces and territories set their own targets, which in sum define the national milestone pathway. On the one hand, this option provides the greatest opportunity for provincial and territorial buy-in and allows their targets to reflect the unique economies, emissions profiles, and abatement opportunities that exist there. However, there's of course a risk that the sum of provincial and territorial ambition will not be enough to meet the national long-term target. So second, provinces, territories, and the federal government could come together to collectively determine the milestone pathway. This option also benefits from supporting greater provincial and territorial buy-in, but in contrast to the first option, the presence of the federal government at the decision-making table increases the likelihood of the pathway being sufficient to meet long-term national targets. However, collaboration between provincial, territorial, and federal governments to decide collectively on the pathway risks lengthy or even deadlocked negotiations. So a third option is for the federal government to set the pathway based on consultation and engagement. On the one hand, this is a familiar approach as there's historical precedents in Canada, specifically the setting of the 2030 target. It also allows different perspectives to be raised and considered throughout the government's milestone setting process. However, this consultation and engagement requires time and resources, potentially slowing down the process. It also only facilitates minor subnational government buy-in, as at the end of the day, it's the federal government making the final call. So finally, an independent expert advisory body could unilaterally determine the pathway. This option would still be based on consultation and engagement to gather evidence, but at the end of the day, it would be the expert body making the final call. So this option ensures that the pathway is based on science and expert advice, therefore taking real or perceived political decision-making out of the mix. It also avoids lengthy or deadlocked negotiations between governments, supporting timely decision-making on the pathway. However, this option does not directly support subnational government or stakeholder buy-in, or even federal government buy-in, for that matter. So again, pros and cons across the various options. So let's move to our third and last question, which is, which levels of government develop policy to meet those milestones? A climate accountability framework can provide federal, provincial, and territorial governments with a variety of respective roles in the development of policy to meet those national milestones, or however they're broken out. And that's regardless of which level of government sets them in the first place. So we outline three main options that differ in their emphasis on federal versus subnational policy. So first, the federal government drives policy. In this approach, the federal government holds the primary role in implementing policy to meet milestones, using a suite of new or strengthened federal policies to fill the gap left by existing provincial, territorial, and federal commitments. On the one hand, making a single level of government responsible for developing policy that can meet milestones can support greater policy certainty. But on the other, it establishes a smaller, more reactive role for provincial and territorial governments. It risks reducing their ability to proactively participate in climate policy development, and it narrows the scope for customizing policies to reflect unique regional contexts and challenges. It also risks creating a larger policy vacuum in the event that a new federal government chooses to reverse course on climate policy. So the second option is that provincial and federal governments could both develop policies to meet milestones, and in the case where joint efforts are insufficient, the stringency of federal policy could be increased to close the gap to meet the milestone. So this approach builds on the existing landscape where both federal as well as provincial and territorial climate policy contribute to reducing emissions. It could include a role for the federal government where it incentivizes provincial and territorial ambition, for example, by providing financial transfers, program funding, or investments. This option creates space for interjurisdictional policy coordination, and the presence of a federal top-up increases the probability of Canada meeting its milestones. However, collaboration on policy development requires time and resources, and its success will rely on the willingness of all governments to do so in good faith by developing, revising, and likely strengthening their own policies based not only on their own objectives, but also those of other governments. So the third option is that provincial and territorial governments could develop policies to meet milestones, with the federal government only playing a convening role or a supporting one by providing financial incentives. So the benefit of this option is that it sidesteps possible tensions and saves the time and resources associated with pursuing more coordinated policy within the Federation. However, a key kind of fundamental challenge is that the absence of a federal policy backstop makes it impossible to ensure that when taken together, provincial and territorial policies will be sufficiently ambitious to reach national milestones. So again, a third choice, lots of pros and cons to the various options available. So in our report, we draw out some conclusions and make some recommendations when it comes to these three questions. So first, some key takeaways. So, one key takeaway for us in this report is that a climate accountability framework is not a silver bullet. It can provide greater transparency around government's plans, policies, and ambitions, and help hold them to account. But it cannot require the implementation of stringent climate policy, since even binding legislation can be repealed. However, while a climate accountability framework cannot in and of itself get Canada to net zero by 2050, it does have clear benefits. It can play an important role in keeping governments on track. However, the details of how climate accountability is designed and implemented in the Canadian context will have really important implications for how well it delivers. So on that front, our report makes three recommendations, which I'll discuss in turn. So first, our report recommends that legally binding emissions milestones should be set only at the national level, And I'll just pause here to note that the Eco-Justice and partners came to a very different conclusion on this question. And so Julia mapped out some of their thinking there. I'll speak to mine here, or my groups here, and we can kind of try to unpack that in some of the discussion afterwards. So our view is that emissions milestones are particularly relevant at the national level, given commitments under international processes. However, legally binding sectoral or provincial and territorial milestones risk creating rigidities that raise the overall cost of reducing emissions. Moreover, binding provincial and territorial milestones would require governments to directly confront difficult regional burden sharing decisions, only to have these debates arise again when the details of policy mechanics were being discussed. Forcing these debates to occur at the early milestone setting stage is likely to be divisive and risks making it even more challenging to move over time toward better policy coordination and convergence in federal and subnational policy ambition. Potential provincial or sector level implications of national level budgets should be provided as information only to inform discussions about the contributions of various sectors and regions. So our view is that a breakout does make sense, but as information only rather than doing it in a legally binding way. So in terms of the process for setting milestones, our report recommends that the federal government set the national milestone pathway in consultation with other governments, with stakeholders, including environmental organizations and industry, with Indigenous peoples, and with the independent expert advisory body. Allowing the federal government to make the final decision, but with requirements that it consult widely, ensures that the milestone pathway considers regional and sectoral circumstances and diverse perspectives without paralyzing the process. So third and finally, our report recommends that the federal government adopt a combined federal-provincial approach to implementing policy that can achieve national emissions milestones. Different levels of government have different policy levers available, and climate policy will be most effective when a wide range of these instruments is brought to bear. The federal government should continue to encourage policy ambition, implementation, and coordination across all levels of government through both the use of policy backstops and financial incentives. A combined federal-provincial approach will require complex and at times difficult engagement, assessment, and dialogue. But it also offers the best chance of making climate policy in Canada politically resilient. An approach that does not rely entirely on either federal or provincial policy has the greatest chance of avoiding backsliding in the event that future governments aim to reverse course on climate policy. On the one hand, encouraging provinces, territories, and Indigenous governments to act meaningfully and leaving space for them to do so ensures a strong base of climate policies will remain in place regardless of the level of future federal ambition. On the other, having federal climate policy backstops ensures that strong climate policy will remain intact across the country in the event that some provinces or territories elect governments seeking to repeal stringent climate policies. So that concludes all the slides that I have, and I'll look forward to questions and comments when we move to that portion of the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Jason. So often when we look to climate action, we do turn to the federal government for leadership. And quite often we forget that there's a lot happening at different levels of government. So right now we're going to turn to Tracy Saxby, who is the Executive Director of My Sea to Sky. And Tracy works very much at the municipal level, and she's going to share some of her insights and ideas and plans on how the municipalities can be empowered to help us meet our climate goals. Tracy.
All right. It is my great pleasure to speak to you today from the traditional and unceded territory of the Squamish Nation. I find this fascinating because we've all come together and we have very different approaches, but we're all trying to achieve the same thing. So what I'm going to be talking about today is a bottom-up approach to carbon accounting and accountability at the municipal level, rather than the top-down approach that you've seen both Jason and Julia talk about. So the challenge that we're facing that's already been discussed is that we're not on track to achieve our greenhouse gas reduction targets. If we look at emissions over the last since 1990, emissions since 1990 have actually increased by more than 20%. And we're seeing a pretty static trend since 2005, but we have a long way to go if we are going to achieve any of our climate targets for Copenhagen, the Paris Agreement, the IPCC targets that Canada is yet to commit to. If we're looking at the provincial targets, we see the same kind of trend. We're moving in the wrong direction and emissions are not going down. BC has separate climate targets. They're aiming for 40% reduction below 2007 levels by 2030, 60% by 2040, and 80% by 2050. And you can see that we have a lot of work to do to reduce our emissions, and even more work if we're going to work towards IPCC targets. And according to Canada's most recent National Inventory Report, BC's emissions have continued to increase again by another 3 megatons in 2018. So we're moving in the wrong direction, and we have to take action to get to zero as quickly as possible. So with COVID, we've been hearing a lot of calls to delay climate action, and I just wanted to highlight what that looks like if we do delay action by even a couple of years. Right now, just using the emissions that we knew about from 2017 and saying that they're 2020 emissions, if we take action every year, we have to reduce emissions by about 2.5 megaton of carbon dioxide equivalent every year to achieve BC's climate target by 2030. It's even more if we want to achieve the IPCC target. If we delay action for 2 years and we continue business as usual and emissions continue to go up as we're seeing them go up, then all of a sudden we have even more work to do, and we have to reduce emissions by more than 5% every year to achieve our climate targets. And we've already seen with COVID, the projections that they're saying we're reducing emissions by worldwide, and this is with shutting down our entire economy, everybody's staying at home, we're only seeing emission reductions of about 8%. So we have a lot of work to do, and we really cannot afford to delay climate action, even by a couple of years. So there are a couple of different legislative frameworks for climate action at both the provincial and the federal level. I'm not going to go into those right now, but they're just to put this in context of how municipal government framework fits within the provincial and federal climate action frameworks. So our goal is to enable municipalities to reduce community-wide greenhouse gas emissions and support provincial and federal emission reduction targets. And the way we want to do that is we want to develop a climate action report card for municipalities to track emissions every year. And we want to develop a municipal climate action toolkit that will have specific resources and policy recommendations that municipalities can implement to help them to reduce emissions and to achieve their climate targets. Why are we focusing on municipalities? It's because it's the local governments that are on the ground doing the work. They are the ones that are engaging. They are the ones that are making decisions on buildings and land use and transport and waste. They're also the ones that are on the front lines of climate change. So whenever there's a wildfire or a flood, it's the local governments that are responding and having to clean up, along with the provincial and federal support that is provided. Municipalities are responsible for about 50 to 80% of greenhouse gas emissions, and the decisions that are being made at a local level on buildings, local transport, waste, and land use, they're all controlled locally. Local governments are much more agile than the provincial and federal governments, and so they can adopt and test new policies very, very quickly. And there's also a lot more opportunities for collaboration at the municipal level to catalyze climate action. And because local governments are on the ground doing the work, they're also better positioned to easily inspire that transformational change with their constituents that we need to see. So this is why we're focusing on municipalities. So what is and isn't being measured right now? So BC has a framework to measure municipal greenhouse gas emissions called the Community Energy Emissions Inventory. And through that, they've been tracking emissions on buildings, transport, solid waste, and then land use change where the data is available. But all of that is being measured right now only accounts for approximately 25% of emissions. At the federal level, through the National Inventory Report, they're measuring territorial or sector-based emissions, and this includes the emissions that are being measured through the CEEI process, but it also includes emissions from industry, agriculture, and oil and gas. So this accounts for approximately 50% of emissions. But we're missing about 50% of the picture here. Because we're not tracking or measuring the emissions that are associated with the production, transportation, the use and disposal of products and services that are consumed by our community, like food, goods and services, or flights. So there is a different framework that some municipalities are starting to adopt, called the consumption-based emissions inventory. And this is critical because if we're not tracking all of our emissions right now, we can't take action to reduce them. If we don't know that they're there, if we don't know how much it is, then we can't do anything to solve that problem. So why is it important to track our emissions? The first reason is it helps us to establish a consistent baseline for every community in BC. And talking about carbon budgets, it allows us to plan like, okay, well, what are the carbon budgets for each community? How much can we continue to burn? And it allows communities to take action. It supports evidence-based climate action planning. By tracking annual emissions, it allows municipalities to identify, so what's working, what isn't working. It lets them adjust policies so that municipalities can continue to reduce emissions. It lets them experiment with new policies and share success. It improves accountability and transparency, and it inspires that community engagement and behavior change that we really need to see. And ultimately, it's going to help enable municipalities to achieve their climate action targets. And then by achieving municipal climate action targets, that's going to help the province and the federal government achieve their climate action targets. So what we're proposing is a climate action report card that tracks emissions every year. And this is what this could look like. So on the left panel, we have emissions here from Squamish, and these are actual numbers that have been measured independently by each of these municipalities. And I have just taken them and put them forward to pretend that they're happening this year. But these are actual emissions from Squamish in 2017, from Whistler in 2018, and from West Vancouver in 2010. And so while we can't technically compare these emissions right now, let's pretend that we can. And so you can see, you know, what the emissions are for each of these communities. And you can see clear trends or issues like where the emissions are happening. So for example, right now, you can tell that transportation is the biggest source of emissions in each of these communities. So now if we start tracking emissions every single year, and on the right panel here, you can see I've sort of done a mock-up of what this could look like moving forward. So I'm going to click on Squamish, and I'm going to look at what our emissions have been over time. And you can see now that we're tracking emissions locally every year, we can see where our emissions are coming from. And you can see the impact that the policies and public engagement campaigns are having directly. So we're having some success reducing our emissions through transportation. We're having success reducing emissions through solid waste, but we're not seeing any change in residential buildings or in emissions from commercial and industrial buildings. It's actually increasing. So this allows municipalities to look at this information and go, okay, we want to continue what we're doing with transport and solid waste, like we're on track there, but we obviously need to either implement new policies or we need to perhaps implement a public engagement campaign so that we can continue to reduce emissions from residential buildings and commercial industrial buildings and ensure that we are on track to achieve the climate targets that are identified for each municipality. We've also mocked up in here a possibility to include carbon budgets in this. If we can identify what the carbon budgets are for each municipality, along with what their IPCC targets are, it really allows municipalities to start figuring out how to do this on the ground to implement the climate actions that we need that will help us get to zero. So to be able to do this, we have 5 challenges that we need to resolve first. And the first challenge is around accountability, because most municipalities don't have accountability mechanisms or legislated targets that will reduce emissions at the municipal level. The BC Climate Action Charter is non-binding here in British Columbia, and many municipalities are not independently reporting community-wide emissions. And that's partly due to budget constraints, it's partly due to data issues. We just don't have the data to be able to do that easily. So we have a couple of solutions to solve this accountability challenge. And one is to initiate provincial and federal discussions to determine how can we make greenhouse gas reduction targets binding for all provinces and all municipalities. So for example, how can we make the BC Climate Action Charter binding? And we want to legislate municipal greenhouse gas reduction targets to align with the IPCC targets and within Canada and within BC. What we're seeing right now is municipalities have all of these different targets and the provinces have different targets. The federal government has different targets. The way that we're accounting for all of this information is different as well. So we want all of these targets to align so that we're all working towards the same goal, including with First Nations government as the 4th level of government. The second challenge is around cost and capacity. So there's a serious lack of budget and staff capacity to track community-wide emissions every year. And there's also a lack of budget and staff capacity to identify best management practices and policies. What we're seeing, particularly in smaller communities, is that they're having to choose between measuring emissions and reducing emissions. But if they're taking action to reduce emissions, then they don't actually know if those actions are effective or not. So that's a big problem. So what we're proposing is for the provincial and federal governments to track community-wide emissions every year across BC and ultimately to expand that across Canada. And we want them to implement policies and legislation to provide funding and capacity building for municipalities. So that could look like a milestone-based incentive program that will help municipalities to achieve their climate targets. So say a municipality manages to reduce emissions by 10%, that will unlock funding that will then allow them to take the next steps in climate action, and whether that's infrastructure upgrades or whatever changes need to be made. We also want to develop a climate action policy toolkit that municipalities can adapt and implement. It really comes back to lack of capacity at the local level. Municipalities, they don't have the staff capacity to be able to go out and figure out, okay, what are the best management practices on solar panels? Or what are the best management practices on heat pumps? Or active transportation, or public transit. So this is something that we want to start compiling a climate action policy toolkit that any municipality can take and then adapt it and implement it in their community, but to make it as easy as possible for local governments to take action on climate change. The third challenge is around data. We don't have the data. I really want to just say, like, show me the data. Like, we need access to data so that we can track emissions every year at both the CEEI and the CBEI level. There's a distinct lack of data or poor quality data, even though the provincial government in BC has been reporting local emissions through buildings and waste since 2012. The quality of data that we have available on transportation is not good enough. So they're not reporting transportation data, which means that municipalities are then having to go and hire consultants to independently assess data. And that just doesn't work, because then you can't compare between different municipalities. It makes it much more expensive for municipalities to do this. So we really need access to good quality data. There's also a significant time lag to access existing data, just because of how long it takes for the data reporting and then the QA, QC to happen. And there's, in BC, we're pretty well positioned with data sources because we're fairly centralized, but across other provinces across Canada, that data may be much more decentralized and more difficult to access. So these are some of the conversations that we need to have. And one of the first things we want to do is to convene experts that includes municipalities to identify, all right, in an ideal world, forgetting about politics, forgetting about privacy issues, what is the data that we need to track our emissions accurately at the local level, using both the CEEI and the CBEI framework? How can we legislate access to this data at both the federal and provincial level? So an example of this is we need to require ICBC, which is the local car insurance provider, to collect odometer readings when people renew their car insurance. Then it makes it so simple. If we know what vehicle somebody is driving and we know how far they're driving, we can calculate their emissions and then we can collate that at the municipal level, so that we know what are the emissions from transportation within each community. And we want the provincial government and the federal government to collect and provide access to that critical data every year. The fourth challenge is around methodology. The existing CEEI methodology is out of date and it relies on poor quality or incomplete data. It's currently only measuring emissions from buildings and waste, and that comes back to the issues with the data that we have. We don't have good data on transportation. There's no standardized methodologies mandated to measure community-wide emissions. So when communities like the City of Vancouver or Squamish or Whistler are going out and they're tracking their emissions every year, they're doing it using completely different methodology. So that means that we can't, it's like trying to compare apples to oranges. And there's also inconsistency between how the provincial and federal governments are calculating their greenhouse gas emissions. It's so confusing as a layperson trying to figure out how, like the targets are different, the numbers are different. Like we need to just make this consistent for all levels of government, local, provincial, federal, First Nations. Like we all just need to be using the same methodology and working towards those same goals. So the solutions is to improve the CEEI methodology so that we can accurately track community-wide greenhouse gas emissions and provide that data every year to the municipalities. And what framework we're starting to talk about now is there a way that we can use locally determined contributions that will then inform the provincial and nationally determined contributions? We want to transition to both the CEEI and the CBEI framework at the municipal level so that we can start to talk about emissions that are not currently being measured. So those are the emissions from food, goods and services and flights. And we want to standardize all of these calculations between the local, provincial, federal and First Nations governments so that the locally determined contributions, as I said earlier, are informing the nationally determined contributions. And then the final challenge is around jurisdiction. Most municipalities don't have jurisdiction to create legislation which will enable them to achieve climate targets. So how can we support local government act or community charter amendments which will empower municipalities to achieve local climate targets? So in my ideal world, we have access to the data we need to accurately track local greenhouse gas emissions. We have standardized targets and methodologies between all levels of government. We measure and report emissions every year at the local level, which will then allow municipalities to adjust policies and public engagement campaigns that are proven to reduce emissions. The locally determined contributions will inform the provincial and national determined contributions. And we can collaborate so that we are as effective and strategic as possible and we're working towards a common goal. And our success, what we achieve here, inspires the rest of the world to follow Canada's lead. I do believe that we can get to zero carbon by 2030. I do believe this is possible. We just need to be as effective and strategic as possible and make a plan so that we can do this. And I'm going to pass it back to Jennifer.
Thanks, Tracy. That was fantastic. So interesting to hear what's happening, as you say, from the bottom up, as opposed to the conversation that I'm more involved in, which is the top down. So thank you for all that lovely information. So I now want to turn to some questions for our panelists. So if our panelists can turn their videos back on so we can see you. And I want to start with, I mean, both Julia and Jason, you both pointed out, and Tracy touched on this as well, the challenge of trying to get our different levels of government to work together on this. And it's no secret in Canada, both on climate and on other issues, there's tension when it comes to federal-provincial relationships, and the politics of that gets in the way of good results, of good policies being implemented. And it's a problematic issue that we can't get away from. And as Tracy said, it'd be nice not to have to deal with all the politics, but politics is also the art of decision making. So how do we play within this space to get the best outcome? So Julia, I'm wondering first if you could start just by talking about the approach that you guys have chosen, which is the non-binding subnational approach. How do you think this will play out within the politics of the country? And more so, and this is a question that came from Ray Nakano from that he submitted in the chat. What are some of the tools that the government can use to try and work with the provinces to get them to set and follow subnational budgets?
Thanks, Kat. So what our proposal, you know,
I'm just going to change my name, Julia.
Oh my God, I've done that twice now. I've gotten so used to having conversations with Kat on these webinars. It's like the Kat and Julia show. So that's, yes. And thank you, Jen. Okay, so with those big questions in mind, our approach really starts with the observation that these conversations, these hard conversations, are already happening. They're happening now, but they're happening, as you say, in that very political way. So one of the things we wanted to do right off the bat was think about, there's two main things. One, how to make that conversation less political, how to make it data-driven and institutionalized rather than ad hoc and positional. And also, we wanted to, and this is really important, just again, remember how significant the challenge is before us, how quickly we have to act. And what we know from past experience is that while there can be successes in the truly multilateral approach, it takes a lot of time. And we have sadly not used the time we had when we had it. We don't have that time anymore. So we have to take a different approach. It will come with more challenges, and the CICC's report does a great job of addressing those pros and cons. But the conclusion that the coalition that produced those our reports came to is that we have to accept them as necessary given the situation that we are currently in. So how to engage the process we outline really does front end a lot of discussion and consultation, with a big role, a significant weighting for the arm's length experts. So the CICC's options, there's a slide which is great for different roles and different ways to locate the final decision-making around setting carbon budgets. Our approach kind of falls in between a couple in that we significantly weight the technical expertise of the arm's length experts and the processes attach that weight. So their reports have to really be addressed, and their reach is quite significant through the whole process. There is room for consultation and discussion, and we don't prescribe that exactly, but there are different ways for that to happen. It should all be really public, and we should make the language of this about equity, about burden sharing. There's a great question from someone about that, about consumption versus how we track GHGs and set those budgets. All that should be part of the discussion. And there's some great academic work out there already about how to have that type of discussion. So that's the process. How to get provinces ultimately, yes, those would need those subnational carbon budgets, and national carbon budgets are set as binding on the federal government. One point I do want to make is that subnational carbon budgets would be implied in any national carbon budget. we're just making them patent. We're making them explicit, because anytime you set a national carbon budget, it's achieved by pushing down on emissions across the country. And if you don't push down more here, you know, you've got to have a discussion about how that pressure is applied throughout the nation. And the big tools are spending, regulation. We think about the Canada Health Act. There are large sums of money that come from the federal government to the provinces every year that support that whole system. And we've seen it play out extremely positively in delivering universal health care that allows us to plan to address challenges that we face today, all of us sitting at home rather than together in a room. So those, I think, all work together in our framework.
Great, thank you. And Jason, now turning to you and just putting a little bit of a finer point on it, the recommendation that you have is that it's a federal accountability and milestones, and that it's just information sharing for the provinces. And it seems to me that that is more of how things have been done in the past, although there's been the sectoral approach as well. And I'm wondering how you are going to, your plan or your recommendations overcome some of the challenges in the past, which, as Julia pointed out, haven't necessarily worked. So what are we going to do that's new that's going to help overcome those challenges?
Yeah, so I mean, a few things I'd mention. One is that, I mean, I think what we're really disagreeing on is where the starting place for these discussions ought to be. So I've done some work in a previous context on kind of trying to define, you know, regional breakouts of emission reduction targets and what's fair. And the challenge is everybody has their own definition of what's fair. So some might point to the level of cost that it's going to take to meet a certain target. Others might point to historical emissions for a jurisdiction. Some might call for an equal percentage reduction. You know, everybody do minus 20%. Others might point to the historical efforts that they've made and want credit for that. So even when you have an expert-driven process, you're not going to arrive at a clear view on what's fair. And so our view is that starting those discussions with how we're going to distribute the burden is not as practical of a starting place when compared to the idea of, well, what are we all going to bring to the table? What is your contribution? And then we'll figure out after that how we're going to close the gap. I think where we certainly agree is that this is inevitably going to be messy, that it's not, you can't get around the role of the provinces in Canada, and how you accommodate it is really a matter of perspective. I mean, I think it's telling that, you know, two different groups of reasonable people with knowledge in this area, guided by many of the same values, come to the opposite conclusions in terms of what the best path forward is. So I think, you know, in terms of the question of how to get provinces to participate meaningfully, you know, we would point to the use of incentives. And another thing that we call for in our report is the use of subnational accountability frameworks. So I didn't talk much about this in my remarks, but you know, we think there's a really strong case for having these same accountability frameworks at the provincial level, that provinces should be accountable to their own citizens. And these processes would allow them to articulate clearly what they intend to contribute to a national process, the national framework, so that we can air out these tensions and disagreements in terms of what has to be done in terms of closing the gap. And similarly, municipalities, that, you know, our report stops short of saying every municipality ought to do this, because we think for some capacity constraints might be an issue, but where it makes sense, it can certainly only help. So having subnational governments with their own accountability frameworks that feed into a national one, using federal incentives, using policy backstops, is a way to drive and increase provincial policy ambition. But it's simply a matter of perspective, I think, at the end of the day, that it's our view that the more practical approach is to start from the place of contributions rather than from voluntary contributions, rather than allocated burdens, because that's just sort of it goes round and round in terms of what's fair, from my experience.
Yeah, I totally agree with you saying no matter which way we approach this, it's going to be messy and it's going to be hard. But I think the more we talk about the values of these different approaches, the more we can problem solve. So thank you very much for that. Tracy, I just want to turn to you now, because we do have this, you know, we've talked about the challenges of the federal-provincial relationship, and I'm wondering, you gave such a great summary of what can be done at the municipal level. How can that power, that work that's being done municipally, build and push the provinces to be more accountable for those and feed more into the federal-provincial discussion? And just to make it a bigger question, how big is the extent of the work you're doing? What are you seeing from other municipalities across the country? And is this really a growing movement that's going to become a real push on the federal and provincial governments to be more accountable?
Yeah, I do believe that there's a lot of leadership coming from the local level, and we're seeing that across the country because municipalities have declared a climate emergency. They have adopted the IPCC targets, so they're ahead of both the provincial and federal government right now. And I also think that it's very fascinating having this conversation because I think that the top-down approach and the bottom-up approach, they can work together. So I don't think this is an either or. I think this is very much trying to figure out how to find the synergies in these two approaches. We need the accountability at the federal and provincial level, but we also need accountability at the municipal level. And we're seeing that leadership at the municipal level. So it's really that grassroots swell of support for climate action that I think is going to encourage provincial and federal leadership to step up. And just to address something that you had said earlier about politics, my background is a marine scientist. I've been working in climate change my entire career. We don't have time for politics anymore. As Julia was saying earlier, we just don't have time. So we need to figure these questions out very, very, very quickly. And the reason that I started focusing on the municipal governments is because that was where I saw an opportunity for immediate change, where we have been seeing that lack of leadership at the provincial and federal levels over and over again. So that's how I see things fitting together.
Great, thank you so much. And I just want to turn to the other panelists that we have with us to see if they wanted to add anything to that very, very important conversation. Kat, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, sure. I might start with this conversation about subnational versus national targets and burden sharing. I also want to try to address a couple of the questions, really good questions that I've seen in the Q&A in the chat. So I'll begin by saying, Jason just said that, wow, these organizations produce these reports about the same thing and we came to such opposite conclusions. And really, I've read all the reports and in fact, we agree on almost everything, except for this very small difference where we have said, you have to make the subnational carbon budgets explicit because we need to have a conversation where we're somehow creating a home, we're somehow institutionalizing what is currently simply a political conversation that doesn't actually happen in real terms. So we do have conversations about burden sharing, but the conversation happens in a way where one province says, I've already done my fair share, you look over there. And then when we go over to the province that province is telling us to take a look at, that province says, oh, no, there's nothing to see here. There's nothing more for us to do. And we need to figure out how we can have that conversation in a way that's far more generative than it currently is. And Jen, can you indulge me to share one slide?
I will indulge you to share one slide.
Okay, I'm gonna just share this one slide because I think this helps to illustrate the conversation that I feel like we as the consortium really want to figure out how to have that we're not really having very effectively in Canada right now. So this is some really good work done by Barry Saxifrage for the National Observer. In my intro comments, I said, we're off track to meet our 2020 Copenhagen emissions reduction target, but the reality is that most of the country is actually on track to meet that target in 2020. And there are a couple of provinces who are off track to meet that 2020 target, and therefore the rest of the country is off track to meet that target. I'm not here to single out those provinces or to talk about why that is right now. I do that in other parts of my work, but in this part of my work, I say, we need to be having a conversation about this in Canada. And we're not having that conversation in a way that's very effective right now. And so we've made recommendations that try to get us to a place where we're having that conversation inside of a framework in an institutionalized way that ideally helps to tone down some of the political rhetoric that those conversations are normally steeped in, if they do happen at all. So that's where I wanted to share on that. A couple of folks have asked, like, what do we do? How do we advocate for this? And the one thing I'll say on that is In this past election, over 60% of voters voted for parties who promised more action on climate change. If we're going to actually deliver more action on climate change in Canada, we need to have an effective means of doing that and holding ourselves accountable to that increased action. So the recommendations we're making here are the backbone of what that increased ambition looks like. So what I would be saying to my elected officials is, I demand more action on climate change. I want to hear about what the government's doing on climate change. And I want your response to climate change to look like we're responding to an emergency. And we've learned in the past few months what responding to an emergency takes and what the necessary steps to that are. So I want you to replicate those steps when it comes to addressing the climate crisis.
Awesome, thank you. Andrew, did you want to add something on the issue of burden sharing?
I just was going to echo what Kat just said that we're actually not, I don't think, that far apart on 90 +% of what the recommendations are. I actually think even within that area of disagreement, what I'm hearing from Jason is that it's important for data about how the budget might be broken up nationally to be available to the provinces and to be available to the public as part of that discussion. So I think we're very, very close on that. The main difference is that we think that at some level, the federal government has to be clear on its own planning of how a national budget will be achieved, and that we can't have the federal government saying, here's what we're going to do, here's our plan to achieve this, without grappling with this question of where the burden will be of those policies and what portion of it do we expect the provinces to do through their policies, what portion is going to be done through federal action. And that means there is a discussion about a federal budget. So why not make it binding on the federal government so that they have to go out and have those discussions in a way that is transparent and informed by the experts.
And before I get to my next question, I'd just like to add, it'd be great to see some leadership from some of the provinces too, trying to facilitate amongst their team would be very lovely to see. Okay, we're running short on time, but I just want to quickly shift to a slightly different topic, which is the main focus of climate accountability legislation. The explicit goal is emissions reduction, but there are other goals and factors that we can try and build into that, such as just transition, such as adaptation. Julia and Jason, maybe quickly, because I know we're running out of time and we just want to have some time for Kat to have some closing words. Maybe just a few quick comments on how some of these other values that we're trying to build into our society going forward can be addressed through this legislation.
Sure, but maybe I can just start. So I think one of the important things to highlight is, eco-justice and friends have their pillars, we have our common elements. One of the common elements that we observed looking across state case studies is going beyond GHG mitigation, that this shouldn't be just a burden sharing discussion, obviously. So what we observed is that in a lot of jurisdictions like UK and New Zealand, adaptation is a big part of the whole planning exercise and the accountability framework. And in some jurisdictions, they even broadened it out to not only a plan for reducing emissions, but a plan for low carbon economic development in general. And that's what France does. So certainly considering those questions, broadening it out to consider equity implications, impacts on Indigenous peoples, it has to be more than a bean counting GHG exercise. Otherwise, it's inevitably going to be.
Oh, never fails that at least, Jason, we just lost your final statement there. You just froze for a little bit, but.
Oh, sorry, I was saying that unless you broaden it out beyond GHGs, it's inevitably going to be a divisive and zero-sum conversation.
Right. Awesome, thank you. Never made it through a Zoom call without somebody freezing. Julia.
Yeah, and the pillar 3 in particular builds that out by saying, build that into your goal setting, your challenge setting, make those impact reports explicit and required. Make a plan to address those impact reports, part of your planning structure. We built that out in part because there was criticism of the UK's act for not doing that as strongly as they might. It was there, but it wasn't as binding as the mitigation aspects were. So when we looked at it, we said, okay, let's make it on essentially equal footing. There are a lot of the same institutions, and the work that one does to adapt overlaps dramatically with the work you do to mitigate. So let's line that up. Let's have, and part of the timing we proposed to, the impact reports would come out before you start your next carbon budget planning process. So you are thinking about the synergies, you are building them into each other, and that whole system is mutually reinforcing. Oftentimes the work you're doing to adapt involves transfer of funds, you're helping people, and that when you attach assistance, like the supportive work with the tough work, reduce your emissions, take that hit to your bottom line, it's a lot more palatable. So again, build that all together, make the whole thing stronger.
Great. All right, well, unfortunately, we're running out of time because I could be here for another hour. I have pages of questions here for you, so I might have to contact you directly, but this has been fascinating. I want to thank you all for your time and for all the heavy lifting you've done, doing the research, digging into this, really trying to figure out what works best for this country, learning from other examples. I think it's fascinating, as Kat says, the similarities between the two different reports, and really, that's really helpful because when we figure out the differences, we start to problem solve those differences as well. And so I think that's really great. And this conversation has given me a lot of great insights into some of that and possibly some pathways forward. So thank you all very much for both the work you do and for showing up today and sharing it with everyone. And Kat, I think I'll just turn it back to you for some final closing words.
Thanks, Jen. So yeah, I'm just here to say thank you so much to all the panelists. It's been really great to have you. Amazing just to see like such a comprehensive scoping of what it's going to take to make sure that Canada never misses another climate target. And I feel like all the good thinking is here. So that's really heartening. And yeah, thanks so much to Jen for facilitating for us, to Jason, Julia, Tracy for being our panelists, and to Andrew, Dale, and Kato for being here with me in the background. Once again, the recordings and the presentations will be available for everyone who registered in a follow-up email. And you can always take a look at our website or our YouTube channel to find recordings of this and other webinars that we've done in the past. So thank you so much, everyone. Really great to have you. And yeah, we will be posting this webinar as soon as we have the recording. Have a great day. Bye, folks.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.